Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I am here with.
Hi, I'm James. I am on the editorial team over at Chaosium, and I was one of the editors on No Time to Scream, which I believe is what we're talking about today.
Yes, yes. No Time to Scream, such a great title for a Call of Cthulhu horror adventure. It's interesting. This has come out at the same time as Order of the Stone, another adventure source book from Chaosium based on the Call of Cthulhu role playing game. And I think that's wonderful. And I love the more stories that the company can put out, the better. But I'm intrigued about the fact that they're both coming out closely at the same time. But that's because this book has a different focus than Order of the Stone. While Order of the Stone has three adventures that are tied specifically together, these are three separate one shots. Am I correct about that?
Yes, absolutely. There's a little bit of a different focus for the two of them. So, Order of the Stone is focused on campaign play. It's a little bit of a miniature campaign. You jump in, you can make your own characters or pick from a couple of pre-gens, and you're following the same story over a longer time span. You've still got all of the same kind of horror action that's going to get into the story, but it's got several stages, and you're going to see the characters develop, and you're going to be presented with different kinds of scary things and threats throughout the course of the adventure. No Time to Scream, as you've just said, is 3 one-shots. So each one is this bite-sized piece of horror that you can jump into very easily, you can dive into, and you can really have fun with. And there's options within each one for you to flex them a little bit, either have them run a bit longer, or even if you'd like, push them a little further out. But the idea is that you're kind of looking at the difference between a horror series and a couple of horror movies, a sort of anthology-based kind of thing.
For this book particularly, how did the idea for this come to be? What led for the creation of this book?
No Time to Scream kind of came about through both a couple of really cool ideas by the various writers, but also from a sort of production process artifact. We basically had a lot of short scenarios that we were putting together. People might be familiar with Gateways to Terror, which is another product in the Call of Cthulhu catalog, and that's a collection of another 3 anthology scenarios designed to really pull people in and get them playing the game. It's very introductory focused. No Time to Scream was initially conceived very much in that vein. There might even be some old manuscripts of No Time to Scream where it actually has Gateways to Terror 2 as a working title, but I'm not entirely sure how quickly we got rid of that and pulled it in a different direction as the book started to develop and focus on different ideas and themes. Basically, it was, as with Gateways to Terror, something where we really wanted to get people into the action quickly. But as we started to look at the individual scenarios we were pulling in, and we had a couple of different ones that we were maybe going to use, we realized that there was this coherent theme forming between all of them, which is this time is running out. And we lent into that and pushed it forward, and it became what it is now.
So, what can you tell us about these 3 adventures? What's the as non-spoilery as you can? What's the premise behind each of them?
Sure. So there's 3 adventures. There's Aurora Blue, A Lonely Thread, and Bits and Pieces. And each of them focuses on a different area and has kind of a different focus and some different gameplay mechanics at work. A Lonely Thread is the first scenario where you arrive at a cabin in the woods to visit an old friend of yours. And without getting into too many details so that people can explore it as they want, there's something very wrong in the cabin. And you need to figure it out as quickly as you can. And the longer you take, the worse things are going to get rather quickly. There's a nice combination of social role playing, of investigation, and then, of course, action, the severity of which can be much worse if you don't solve things quickly enough. Bits and Pieces is this lovely kind of pulpy, high octane, a bit ridiculous, schlocky horror. Really fun, a little more combat focused, and also something where you can really flex that combination of laughter and fear at the same time. Whereas Aurora Blue is much more character driven, taking place in a really unique environment, in a really unique space, and following the journeys of a collection of pre-gens that actually have much more distinct stories and distinct character arcs that you can explore and flex as you explore a very remote region of the mountains in Alaska.
So in No Time to Scream, I see that you're a writer, you're an editor. I also see that you also helped out with the art direction. If I may ask, what was that like? How is this book set up design wise?
Yeah, so I wore a couple of hats across the creation process, basically because, as I mentioned, there was a little bit of changes that went into the shape of the book over time. I ended up doing quite a bit of writing on it, which is why I have that additional writing credit. In terms of editorial, that's primarily what I was doing, going through and editing and doing all of that stuff. Art direction, we have a couple of different ways that we will do art direction within Chaosium. For this particular product, I was writing up a lot of the briefs and sending them through and working with a couple of artists to try and refine and decide on exactly what we wanted for the images. I say that, fortunately, that is something that I have not done a whole ton. I've had cause to do it in the past, but No Time to Scream, really, I was pretty new at writing art briefs, especially for the production style that we were using at the time. So I kind of put it all together. I put a quite detailed and very verbose. I'm so sorry to everyone who had to read through the incredibly long descriptions of that. And Mike Mason stepped in to help me refine that quite a bit and eventually get it to the artists who were able to turn it into the fantastic art that's in the book. It was really exciting because I'm not a particularly visual person. I have these pictures in my head, but I've found over time that when I attempt to articulate them and describe them, although I can make them sound kind of cool, if you actually get into the nuts and bolts of, well, what would that look like? I don't really know. So it was great to see stuff that I had conceptualized, kind of pulled out and unwoven into these coherent images that I really like. I'm a big fan of the art in No Time to Scream.
I've always been interested in knowing about how adventures are selected for source books. You have a very talented team working on this. You have B.W. Holland, who's just won an Emmy recently for his solo adventure.
Alone Against the Static, that's right, yeah.
Yes. And you also have Bridget Jeffries, who I recognize from the
Miskatonic Repository, absolutely. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Recently, also, I'm not sure when this video is going to release, but recently now working as community manager, I believe, for Chaosium.
That's right. That's right. So yeah. So when all of you work together, how does the process of selecting a story come to be? How does that work exactly as a team?
It would be a little bit unfair of me to try and categorize all of the projects that Chaosium does in a similar vein, because much like the art direction, there's a bunch of different procedures that can get used per book. And that sort of comes out here with each of the individual scenarios, which came into No Time to Scream in a kind of unique way. The long story short is that we wanted to put together something that was focused on shorter play sessions and that was going to come out with this sort of horror anthology style. And we started looking through the back catalog of what we had available. I believe with A Lonely Thread, Brian's scenario, I'd been working with Brian on something like a peripheral piece, and I think A Lonely Thread was potentially going to exist there, and we sort of played around with a little bit and decided actually it really, really fit well within this space. Bits and Pieces was something that we'd been sitting on for a while and just hadn't quite found the right spot for, and it was such an evocative idea that we sort of went, yes, that, and grabbed it, pulled it in. And with Aurora Blue, I could see that it fit the style of No Time to Scream. It was also something that we had and that Bridget had put together for us. But I got the chance to actually chat with Bridget a little bit during the editorial process, bringing it from the submitted version towards what it finally was in No Time to Scream. Mike Mason obviously involved a lot in that. Since it is a more character-driven piece, it was important to kind of tease out all the details there. And I think it's ended in a really exciting spot. But yeah, every scenario can kind of be different. You'll sometimes get something that comes in really quickly, and then you want to pull that fast for a variety of reasons. Other things can sit on the back burner for a while and then get pulled in, and every stage in between, basically. Often it's not so much a reflection on the content of the scenario itself, or even the like focus or the amount of work it might take to shape it for whatever product you're pushing it for. Not necessarily because it's unsuitable, but just because different products have different needs, and what it might have been originally submitted for could have been peripheral to what the final thing that it ends up in. So it's a real complicated web, and sometimes it's a little bit complicated to give one exact reason that certain scenarios get picked. But that's the interesting editorial process of it all, and that's part of the fun forming, one of these books.
I love the cover for this book. How did this piece come to be? How did you decide that this is going to be the cover for your book?
Well, with that, I should clarify that I very fortunately did not have the picture that I recommended for the cover put in place. Or it's a very fine piece, and it's just inside the book, actually. I originally put a brief for the cover, and I said, I reckon something like this. I'm someone who really likes very colorful, very vivid art. So if you flip into the book and you actually see the art with the pocket watch spinning open and sort of a fraction for each one, that was one of the ones that I put through. But you've just said it's a really great cover, and that's because brighter heads than I in terms of marketing and cover design look at all of the art, and there's discussions that happen, and this one actually is the most evocative. This is what we should put at the front. So this is a piece that we had commissioned for No Time to Scream, and it was inside the book. And upon reviewing things and talking with layout and the various different branches within Chaosium, decided actually this is going to be this is going to be the best cover for this. So I think that you're absolutely right. I love this cover, and I think it was the right decision to put it there. But I'm also a fan of all of the different pieces of art inside, including the one that now sits in a Piece of Pride as a sort of first interior art piece, which was my initial proposal for the cover.
So just to clarify, for anyone watching or listening to this, and they're wondering, are these adventures made for new players? Are these adventures made for experienced players? What would you say about that exactly?
The best onboarding product for Call of Cthulhu is the starter set, and the Keeper's Rulebook basically gets you going with everything you need to play the game in perpetuity. Gateways to Terror is a fantastic way to learn the game and to introduce it to new people with very, very quick focus scenarios. It is more beginner focused than No Time to Scream. Even though these scenarios are short, there is some added complexity to them. As I mentioned, Aurora Blue is incredibly character driven. Bits and Pieces has a whole pulp kind of feel to it, and you can directly inject some pulp mechanics into that if you would like to really bring out that side of the game. If you are familiar with the Call of Cthulhu rule set, but you want to try different things, you want to see what the range of kind of horror anthology can bring to your table, this is a great thing to grab. And it also is just fun scenarios that you can insert one or two relatively easily into different places. It fits pretty well within the scope of another structured campaign. It's also a good lesson in brevity, or in extending out and finding the most exciting parts of the scenario that you want to turn into something larger. Since the scenarios in No Time to Scream are all designed to run pretty quickly in a single session of play, you want to get the entire arc of it through. So there's a full resolution to everything. But if you have such a good time with that and you're really enamored of the idea and you want to find more of that anthology, more of that feeling, you can see the nodes and the little places that you could expand the story and you could make it bigger. Bits and Pieces is a great example of that, because without spoiling things, there is an invitation to keepers to make a large part of the drama behind the scenario completely their own. It's a similar situation to Crimson Letters in the Call of Cthulhu Keeper rulebook for people who are more familiar with that kind of material too.
So when I craft an adventure, let's say I'll say Dungeons and Dragons as an example. If I want to craft a fantasy adventure in that type of vein, I would definitely go into thinking about movies I watched in the 80s, books I've read during that time period, and just pick some of my favorite parts and craft an adventure. When you write an adventure, especially for Call of Cthulhu, where it's horror, it's adventure, but it's horror. Where does your mind go to for inspiration? When you're trying to create ideas, where does your mind go?
That's a great question and a very familiar sensation of having your mind cast back to your favorite movies when you were a child. One really interesting thing, and this is a little bit tangential to what you were asking specifically about horror for Call of Cthulhu scenarios, but I recently had a really acute sensation of that drawing from childhood that was a little bit more unusual. I'm bilingual. People who hear my terrible French accent, who are French speakers, might be surprised to hear that. But I grew up speaking French and English, and I don't get a chance to speak French a ton because I live in Australia. And whenever I go to France, I very often have this couple of days where I'm a little bamboozled, and then my brain kicks back into gear, and suddenly I find it very, very difficult to write the same way because my brain, when I think for a piece of like horror inspiration or a fantasy inspiration or whatever it might be, jumps to different pieces of source material. So instead of thinking of The Thing, for example, which is one of my favorite English language horror movies, and other stuff that might have scared me when I was a kid or whatever, it jumps to French comic books and odd like scenes from the Tintin animated series keeps popping up when I think of Call of Cthulhu when my brain is in French mode. I'm not entirely sure why. Specifically, I think it was the Seven Crystal Balls, the animated episode of that, really frightened me as a young child. So just that description that you gave was so evocative. I wanted to mention that. But yeah, no, it's definitely a media of all sorts, and I find the most exciting places where that is instead of horror movies themselves, because a horror movie will give you absolutely a masterclass in condensed horror, but that's also what it's doing. And I feel like if you draw specifically from the inspiration given by a horror movie to create a derivative product, not derivative in a bad way, just something that is inspired by, it's all a big mess of mutual inspiration. I think that you lose a bit of the sort of authenticity of the horror in a way because it's a bit of a reactive thing. I find that the most scary sources of inspiration are incidental horror that arose from other pieces of content. So if you were watching a fantasy movie, if you were reading a book that wasn't nominally horror, but something really got to you and it stuck with you, those are the things that really excite me and that I like to bring out and stuff like that. One of the ideas I've been playing with recently is I remember when I was about 12 or 13 reading a book that was like a James Bond sort of spy thing that had a section on people stealing organs. And that has always been in the back of my mind as a terrifying thing. I've never quite figured out how to bring it into a horror scenario or a bit of Call of Cthulhu material yet, but I'll figure it out one day. Obviously, there's some great stuff about people stealing organs, but these little things that stay with you, you want to tease them out.
So, if I may ask, some tips for each of the three adventures in this book. A Lonely Thread, which I know you had a stronger hand in when it comes to the writing. Any tips concerning that adventure?
A Lonely Thread is very fun from a social role playing perspective. And my tip for anybody jumping into that, this is a little more keeper focused, but I will keep it spoiler free. You need to be conscious of how clearly you telegraph clues about what is happening in the larger scenario to players. You can very easily be too obvious and they will immediately figure everything out. But there is an instinct that I've found a couple of people lent into in playtesting, which is to hide and veil things a bit too much. And you can very successfully do that. And then because Call of Cthulhu can very easily fall into this longer term kind of play, it's very easy to just lull the players into a total false sense of security and they will have no chance to do things. So you do want people to figure out what is happening. It's a horror movie kind of thing. And it can feel quite counterintuitive to really build towards the point where they have figured it out. And yeah, so the advice would be indulge the investigations that your players want to go on. Let them pick at the scab. Don't try and smooth it over too much.
If I may ask, what is the setting and timeline for A Lonely Thread?
Lonely Thread is a cabin out in the countryside in the 1920s. So it is classic Call of Cthulhu timeline. It's set in a remote rural area. It's the vacation cabin of a professor. So it's a nice atmosphere, but a very kind of submarine focused area. You're not going to be wandering too far out of one individual's house.
Okay, so my concern, not really a great concern, honestly, is that when it comes to anything with the woods, I try to be as thorough as I can about nature. I grew up in the city, so the idea of cabins and tents and things like that to me is just a bit foreign at times. Um, but that sounds like something I'll have to worry about. This is going to be just
No, you're going to be very pleased. Maybe cottage might be the better word. The
mm,
investigation really is focused inside. You can go out to the garden and explore the front yard and some woodshed out the back, but it is the story of one person's house, and it is not a story about the intricacies and details of survivalism or camping or things like that. The most interesting aspect of it, much more, is unraveling the psychology of the owner of the cabin and figuring out exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what other influences may be involved.
and it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, the way you describe the setting as a keeper, I could take this like I put this in New England, I could put this in Canada, I could put this anywhere. Um,
You You absolutely could. It can fit pretty much anywhere. I dived into some research about Arkham more broadly for a lot of the material in No Time to Scream. So I think that nominally, there's some inspiration of like the woods surrounding New England, basically. But yeah, broadly, rural cabin. I mean, really, you could do it. You could do a suburban house if you wanted to. It would require relatively little reworking.
hmm. So, bits and pieces. What you can tell me about that adventure?
Bits and Pieces is much more action driven. It is a little bit over the top in that pulpy, wonderful kind of way. My biggest suggestion for Bits and Pieces is to carefully time out uh, when you want your climactic final moments to happen and how you want to execute them. It's a pretty open scenario with a lot of different ways that the investigators can approach the situation. And there's a lot of different suggestions, therefore, since they could potentially deal with certain threats at certain times and have other problems metastasize into something much more serious. You want to really think of when you are going to launch into the most exciting part of the scenario. So balance that out. The second thing is keep very clear track of your physical space. This is something where using the maps, if you're not somebody who usually uses maps, can be really, really helpful. That's not essential, but if you're not going to use the maps, just make sure you are very precise and clear about which investigator is where and what they are doing and when they have walked by themselves somewhere to somewhere else in the morgue.
And just like before, is there anything I may need to research ahead of time? Should I know, so for example, should I know the basics of like how a hospital works, things
I
like
think
that?
you're totally fine. If everything that you will need is contained within the scenario itself, if you would like to do some extra reading to completely best prepare yourself, perhaps if you're going to slot this into an already existing campaign or you're going to expand on it a little bit, some extra details about Arkham can be useful. The St. Mary's Hospital the location is nominally in the morgue below St. Mary's, so you could look a little bit into that. And if you are playing in an established Arkham, you may want to slot it into uh, sort of ongoing action. If your investigators are students and they're consistently getting hurt, they're probably ending up at St. Mary's a lot. Or if you don't have a sort of established acute detail about Arkham and you haven't picked up the Arkham book, you might want to use this scenario as a way to introduce some consistent touchstones towards the setting that you play in, assuming you do play consistently in Arkham.
Before we talk about Aurora Blue, I have to say I really appreciate the flexibility of the maps for bits and pieces. The fact that you don't need them as heavily. Most Call of Cthulhu adventures that I can think of right now tend to be very map heavy. The location is very important, because you will have players that want to explore everything. So I think that's great. I think some keepers may have trouble with that, especially in the beginning, before they get kind of used to that type of that game style. Was that done sort of purposely, or it was just like a happy accident?
I think that for me it was a happy accident. For the cartographers and for Mike and the other designers, it was very much this needs to happen, and it needs to happen in this way. And I was going, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Wow, it works so well. I think that I even made a mistake in part of the descriptions that were given to the cartographers, that the cartographers went, this is not coherent. We can fix this, and preemptively sorted it out for me because I'd made a logical error. Yeah, you'll learn a lot as you continue in the editorial process.
So, Aurora Blue, what tips can you tell us about this adventure? Can you share with us?
Aurora Blue is something where you really want to get buy-in from the entire crew of players that you're playing with. And ideally, you want to go in with as much investment into telling a personally dramatic and introspective story for each character as possible. Now, it is also something where you can run in, you can get terrified and eaten by a monster. Not literally eaten, well, subjective. But anyway, you can get killed by a monster at any rate, and have all of the classic Call of Cthulhu fun. But I think that where this scenario shines is in how it focuses on the pre-gens and how it focuses also on the NPCs and what's happening in general and what's happening in the society at large at the time. The characters, the pre-generated characters in Aurora Blue, from marginalized backgrounds, and there's a lot of storytelling that you can sort of play with there, and you can really focus on exploring a much wider capacity of the setting, even though you're in a very removed part of the setting. Again, a very isolated area of Alaska, on a farm, basically. You're also all playing as set career professionals, which is something that I think can add really interesting dynamics to a game. Call of Cthulhu isn't Pendragon, you're not all knights by default, although you are all investigators, but investigators can come from all walks of life. The pre-generated characters in this case all work for the Bureau of Prohibition, and it again adds some really interesting nuance to why they're there, the relationships between each of them, and what their objectives might be.
That's very fascinating. I love how all these three adventures are totally different from each other, and like even in almost like game style, which is pretty amazing. Again, I might ask, was that done purposely? Did you want each adventure to be purposely almost run differently from each other?
You can see a little bit of the DNA from Gateways to Terror coming through here, where you've got basically more complicated aspects of Call of Cthulhu and different directions that you can pull a story in general start to reveal themselves. Whereas I think that Gateway to Terror, because it is very beginner focused, is really showing you a bunch of very classic locked in scenarios where you're going through the core loop of Call of Cthulhu adventure. As you've mentioned, each scenario in No Time to Scream explores a different one. Bits and Pieces is much more combat focused. A Lonely Thread has a lot of mystery and timing elements to it, and Aurora Blue has much more social consequence and introspective focus on the story of the characters. So yeah, it was very much a deliberate decision. There's all kinds of sort of weird background information that comes from the production process. There was a point, I think, very early on where there was potentially going to be another scenario included, but that is not the case. And you know what? It would be a disservice to that scenario, which may see the light of day somewhere else. It's a long process that goes into seeing how these things will be put together.
Do you have a favorite NPC in this book?
Oh, good. Great question. It's the NPC that has the best ability. It's the one that I have that I alluded to that has a secret point in it. That is to say, in their stat line, they have a really funny joke. I think you might not think it's funny. You'll find them if you pick up the book. Even just saying who they are will immediately give away one of the scenarios. Although if you hadn't guessed by the title and the setting of Bits and Pieces, it's along those lines.
I'm gonna have to email you later. It's like, is this what you're talking about? I've asked this question with other Call of Cthulhu writers. I'm fascinated that eldritch horror, cosmic horror has not dwindled in popularity. In fact, I think it's more popular than since it was since Lovecraft started writing back in the 20s and 30s. Why do you think that is? We have a lot of these like legendary monsters like Frankenstein's monster, the werewolf, Dracula, all these that at one time horrified people. Now it's seen as a joke. Why do you think Cthulhu and creatures like that have endured the test of time?
That's a great question. I probably, and I hate to do this because it seems counter to my own interests as promoting Call of Cthulhu and the mythos as something special. But honestly, I think it's special for different reasons. I don't think that the concept of eldritch horror and old gods is particularly resistant from a horror perspective. You can go and get a plush Cthulhu at anywhere, and people will have characters like from the extended mythos and this terrifying otherworldly place appear in a very casual setting, in a comedic setting all the time. And you can absolutely still get a really, really terrifying version of Dracula and of Frankenstein's monster and of any of those stories and those ideas. I also think that the legacy of cosmic horror in general kind of, although the genre very much codifies in the 20s and 30s and there's more of like sort of an extended vocabulary to refer to it, you can find examples of cosmic horror that go back earlier than the 20s and 30s. The cosmic horror writers of that era were referencing Poe a lot, and I think that if you read some of Poe's work and even Shelley's work, there's plenty of stuff that you can look into and you can see that kind of fear. I mean, even it's so fun when you're running a Call of Cthulhu scenario to find references in very old texts, even old religious texts that can refer to this idea of like a cosmic or great old one-esque being. And it's an idea that's been around for a while. I think that the inherent sort of cosmic power of these creatures from like a conceptual perspective makes it difficult to personify them as maybe more caring and friendly, whereas I think it's possible to do a sympathetic version of many of the other monsters that we've mentioned previously. Like you can have sympathetic vampires. Since these creatures are inherently uncaring because of their scale, it's a little bit harder to pitch that differently. But I'm sure that's been done, and I think that they fit into the larger horror space. It's a fun niche to play with, but I think that it's stronger if it's examined in the full context, and that's what brings out the best stuff, where you look at how it's influenced by everything else.
Is there anything about this that I haven't asked you about? I assume that it has, of course, maps, which Chaosium does a great job with, a great collection of NPCs. Again, Chaosium does a great job with that. Anything extra about about this book?
Gosh, there's a ton of fun stuff and all these little details that I really want to mention. There's all of these jokes that are slotted in at various points of the writing, and interesting ideas that could be teased out more. But I think the best thing to do is just to encourage people to go through and read it themselves and dive in. There are maps, there are characters. There's a huge amount, and I hope everyone has fun with it. I'll say one last thing, which is just my real I'm really glad I got to throw this in. Since I've been reading Call of Cthulhu books for quite a while, one of the first ones I got was I was like 10 years old or something, and I think it was the first role playing game book I got, and I was completely enamored of it. It was at the time I was living in Paris, and I didn't have a lot of English language literature, so this was one of the only things that I had. So I would read it again and again and again. I got really enamored of the period of Call of Cthulhu writing where people would put a lot of funny abilities into their stat lines. So you would have a character that has enjoy food at 95% or something like that, and it just gives you a little bit of like a hilarious note about them. So I don't want to spoil it. There's a really good gag with one of those placed in there, and I'm very fond of it. I'm glad it made it through to the final version.
If I may ask, what are you currently working on or hope to be working on that they can reveal?
For sure. A lot of different things. Continuing with the digital content, continuing with all kinds of Call of Cthulhu editorial. There's so much. I don't think that there's anything that I'd stand from the rooftops and shout out about just yet. It is not the perfect time. Apart from, you can always come and see us play the Stream of Chaos every weekend if you want to see how we play some bits of Call of Cthulhu as well as other games. We're just finishing off a Rivers of London run at the moment. And I'll also say just a huge cheer and celebration to everybody else who worked on No Time to Scream. All of the writers, also all of the proofreaders, the artists, everyone behind the scenes doing everything from licensing to copy editing to the legal and licensing and everything. It's a huge team effort to get any of these books out, and everybody from Dustin, who might send you your physical book, to Susan, who probably made sure that there wasn't a terrible spelling mistake on the front cover, and each of them and everyone else doing a ton of other hats as well. They do so well, and thank you to everybody who's played it or who will play it and who's going to pick it up, and thanks Manny for talking about it.
Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about No Time to Scream and sharing all the tips about it and all that you can share without spoiling too much. Very excited to read this. I think this would be a great helpful game for keepers, especially for those that are trying to find a style that works for them. And it seems like this book is perfect for that, to explore different styles of playing and different tools as well. To our viewers, thank you for watching. Take care.